Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law News produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and we're just going to run through some news stories which will be coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Peter. I'm the solicitor and managing director at Digital Law, and we're back with some a mixed bag of stories, and some of them quite relevant given some of the issues in the news at the moment with regards generally to things like Ukraine and China and the forthcoming Winter Olympics. So I'll pass back to Amelia to start taking us through.
Thanks, Peter. So, like you said, our first stop today is Ukraine. So, a massive cyber attack has warned Ukrainians to be afraid and expect the worst. So this warning hit government websites on the 13th of January, and it actually left some of the websites inaccessible until the next morning. And so Kiev has opened an investigation, and while they have not been too quick to point the finger at Russia, they have hinted that there have been similar strikes in the past against them. So I'll pass over to Peter to unpack this a little bit more.
Yes, thanks, Amelia. So, I mean, the idea of cyber attacks emanating from Russian state-sponsored actors when it comes to Ukraine isn't new. Indeed, the NotPetya attack a few years ago that emanated from eastern Ukraine, or was certainly targeted at eastern Ukraine from Russia, ended up spreading around the world and took down organizations from public sector bodies to large manufacturing organizations, and indeed some of the world's largest law firms were affected by the NotPetya ransomware. And it shouldn't be a surprise that Russia, in the way that they've pioneered asymmetric warfare, in terms of it's now possible to, in effect, cause an awful lot of damage and carry out pretty warlike activity online through cyber attacks, and that the old traditional 20th century method of declaring war by sending a tank over a country's border is now well and truly obsolete, given the huge amount of damage that can be caused, the panic and misinformation that can be spread through a well-timed cyber attack. And I think this is just adding to the sense of it's obviously very difficult, I think, for the people in Ukraine dealing with this, and I'm saying that having been to eastern Ukraine a few years ago to present at a law school for law students, and I really do feel for the people there who are dealing with an awful lot of pressure and then being bombarded with potential cyber warfare like this. Just adds to the foreboding they'll have in terms of what's around the corner, perhaps. But in the meantime, yes, this is an example of the continuing aggression from Russia in terms of their sort of cyber capabilities. But it's showing that now, for any state really having a significant capability in terms of offensive cyber warfare, is very much a must. Iran has this, China has this, and North Korea. All of these states are able to strike very aggressively when it comes to their cyber capabilities, and indeed certainly the UK through its work with GCHQ has fairly significant cyber capabilities as well to be able to take out items of national infrastructure or launch significant attacks. So I think it is worth looking at that in context. But in terms of the so what from this, if you're sat there thinking, well, hang on, what's this got to do with me and my organization? The point is that organizations get caught in the crossfire if a particularly aggressive piece of ransomware is sent out from as a result of the current heightened state of tension. This can mean that any organization that could have a vulnerability in its operating system or in certain bits of software could mean that those systems could end up being taken down, rendered inoperable through a aggressive piece of ransomware, for example. And this is exactly what happened with the NotPetya attack a few years ago. So as always, it's important to make sure that things like operating systems are up to date, that browsers, email clients, all of these things are up to date, that any updates that are pending installation, don't delay, make sure they're installed. It's also a time to be reviewing your IT estate generally. If you've got older devices, older handsets, older tablets that might not be receiving regular support because they could be using older versions of Android or different operating systems that are no longer being supported by that manufacturer, and check, because some handsets manufactured as recently as 2018 and 2019 are no longer receiving support because in some instances their licenses to produce certain products will have expired. Then, you know, always check. Do not presume and think, oh, well, this handset's only 3 years old, I'm sure it's receiving updates and is perfectly safe and secure. Do not presume that by any stretch. So it is always worth looking at your systems, looking at your hardware in particular, and making sure you don't have any vulnerabilities that could mean that your organization gets caught in this geopolitical crossfire that is currently brewing.
So mentioning that, Peter, there has been an attack on Gloucester City Council this week, which has been directly linked to the work of Russian hackers. So it's like you say, this doesn't just affect outside the UK, this is the UK that's been affected. And additionally, there has also been an attack on North Korea's internet this week, where there's been a wave of outages, and as we know, not as many people have access to the North Korean internet as some of the other areas in the world, but this still has a massive effect on all bits of the infrastructure.
Indeed, and once that, indeed, all it takes is an attack on software that can lead to then hardware being disabled, sometimes disabled permanently. It's an example again of that sort of very offensive cyber capability that can have very practical real-world considerations. Grids can go down, systems can go down, the water supply could be disabled, phone systems can be disabled, all as a result of a particularly aggressive cyber attack. And certainly in 2022, these are the things that we need to be very aware of and vigilant of, and make sure that our defences are as primed as far as they possibly can be.
Precisely. And so our next story this week is Italian luxury fashion giant Montblanc has confirmed that they suffered a data breach. The files have been stolen by Alpha V and Black Cat ransomware operations in December, and they've been published on the dark web. So this attack unfolded in the final week of 2021, and it's interrupted all of its IT services. However, the attack only kind of resulted in a temporary outage in this case. So I'll pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Thanks, Amelia. I think the reason why I wanted to make sure we covered this story was 2 points really. I mean, okay, it's another large online retailer hit by a cyber attack and data protection breach. So far, so normal. But first of all, I think the fact that Montblanc were particularly upfront on this. Obviously, they're based in Europe. They'd have to inform the data protection regulators, and they've therefore gone public with what's happened. But they were good. They were prompt in terms of releasing updates on the situation very publicly, making it clear that it took them a while to get their systems back up and running. They prioritized e-commerce shipments. This happened in December, so people may have ordered things hoping to have things delivered for Christmas, and they prioritized those shipments to try and make sure that deliveries went through. So they're being proactive. They just didn't leave customers and the public in the dark. They tried to be proactive in terms of the messaging around this, to sort of say, look, we are doing what we can. And the second thing I liked about this was the fact that they rejected the prospect of paying any ransom to the ransomware hackers, which very often is the approach an awful lot of organizations take. It's almost like, you know, do not feed the do not feed the trolls, you do not feed the hackers. But very often organizations think, well, it's going to be quicker and easier if we just pay the ransom, get the data back, rather than not paying the hackers, losing the data, having to start all over again. Now, in this instance, they didn't pay the ransom. That information ended up being published online, and hence they're now in the difficulties that they're in. But they, on principle, did not wish to pay a criminal enterprise that had compromised their business. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. They felt it went against their founding principles, and they weren't going to do it. And good for them. They've been proactive. They've tried to meet this head on, and hopefully they'll learn from what's gone wrong, and it won't happen again. But a good example of an organization trying to meet this challenge head on, to look after its customers, and to say that, you know, we will not pay a single euro to the hackers that have caused this problem.
Precisely. I think it's important to mention as well, like some of the bigger companies that have been paying these ransoms have been victim of double extortion, where even though they have paid, their data has then been encrypted, and so they've still not been able to access it anyway. So it's nice to see that here they've just decided to kind of surpass that and not pay any sort of ransom.
That's a really good point, Amelia, because also there's been cases where people have paid the ransom and then they've gone, well, we'll allow you to have access to your data, but we'll now demand a second ransom, failing which we will publish the data online, which is still just as bad, still lands you in hot water with the regulator. So it's kind of showing that there is certainly no honour amongst thieves, and really, to be brutally honest, don't encourage them, don't feed them.
Exactly. So moving on to our next story. So I don't think a week goes by where we don't talk about kind of the big cheeses. So we've got WhatsApp, Google, and so this week we're focusing on WhatsApp again. So the US doesn't need to know who they're targeting or show probable cause when ordering Facebook, WhatsApp, or any tech company to help agencies spy on users in newly unsealed court documents. So US federal agencies have been using a 35-year-old American surveillance law to secretly track WhatsApp users with no explanation as to why and without knowing who they are targeting. So I'll pass over to Peter to unpack this very interesting story.
Yes, this is again an example of, for the avoidance of doubt, do not ever use WhatsApp for business-related purposes, because it turns out it's being used by US federal security agencies, or in this instance, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. They've been carrying out organizations to track down different users. In this instance, they were based in China and Macau in the South Pacific, not in the South Pacific, in the sort of Southeast Asia. And in this instance, it's actually a fairly old security law that is being used as the justification by the DEA to use WhatsApp to then track the users. So it turns out that even though, yes, your WhatsApp may be encrypted, it doesn't stop it being used to then track down where a user might be through handset information. And for the avoidance of doubt, if, for example, you are an employee in a highly regulated sector, so for example banking, or if you're a legal professional, or you're an accountant, or you're in any line of business where you need to have security and confidentiality, it's not really great if you're using a security platform that can be compromised so that you can find out the exact location of where the users are. So I'm afraid I keep on banging the drum on this podcast, and indeed I was actually speaking at a legal compliance conference on this yesterday. And to any of you listeners who may have come to us after attending the Legal Training Consultancy's law firm compliance conference yesterday, welcome, hello, thank you for joining us. And I'm going to repeat the warning that I said yesterday, which is do not use WhatsApp for business-related purposes. There are plenty of alternatives out there. You know, use Signal, use BlackBerry Enterprise Messenger, but don't use WhatsApp and don't use Telegram. They are free apps. They are designed for you to sort of stay in touch with a friend. They shouldn't be used to stay in touch with colleagues. You shouldn't be sharing personal data on them. You shouldn't be using it for business-related activity. And to put it bluntly, if it can be used by the DEA to work out where you are, I wouldn't want to use it for just in a personal capacity anyway. So there you go. There are other alternatives to WhatsApp. Don't use it to for business-related activity.
Precisely. And like you say, we speak about WhatsApp a lot. It's just to reiterate, please just don't use it for business purposes. There is no need.
Exactly, and it's also a timely reminder, Amelia. As you know, WhatsApp's been hit by this, I think, €250 million fine by the Irish data protection regulator for practices that are in breach of the European General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. Now, albeit that fine is currently being appealed, the regulators tend not to go and wield these massive fines unless they're pretty sure. So that's another reason why we really shouldn't be touching WhatsApp with a barge pole. And this isn't just us saying, oh, they're having a go at WhatsApp. This is European data protection regulators having a go at WhatsApp and charging them €250 million for the paper as well.
Exactly. And so kind of that leads quite nicely onto our next story. So the Ministry of Justice has contravened Article 15 of the EU and the UK DPA 18, so that's GDPR, and it has failed to provide, without undue delay, 7,753 data subjects with a copy of their data in accordance with its legal obligations. So with the view of the above, the Commissioner has decided to exercise his powers under Section 149(2)(b) DPA to serve an enforcement notice requiring the controller to take the steps necessary to comply with the legislation. So I'll hand over to Peter to kind of unpack all of the regulations there.
Indeed. So in this instance, we're talking about enforcement and enforcement notice. We aren't talking about a fine, but this is pretty embarrassing for a ministry that is dealing with some of the most sensitive data that there is. Ministry of Justice, they handle the administration of the police, the probation service, the prisons, criminal justice system, the whole lot. And if they are not turning around and honouring the rights of data subjects, 7,753 of them who've requested information. We aren't talking here necessarily about 7,753 individual subject access requests. These could have been in bulk, but we're clearly talking about a large volume of subject access requests that are not being dealt with. And the right to access your data is a fundamental right in GDPR, which is of course transposed into UK law via the UK GDPR and the UK Data Protection Act 2018. So this is key legislation. It is this legislation that has allowed for the adequacy decision that the UK benefits from the European Union, allowing the free flowing of data, and therefore driving a horse and coaches through some of the key requirements of that legislation isn't great when it's actually the UK government that is failing to comply with it. And this is the sort of enforcement that therefore needs to be taken by the regulator to say, look, we are trying to clamp down and stop this kind of contravention of the Act, because otherwise you'd be worried that in Europe might be tempted to look again at that adequacy decision as a result. And it's also the fact here that, you know, as I say, the subject access request is a fundamental right, and you should be able to get hold of your data within 30 days of making the request. So if you've waited and you've waited and you've waited some more, then that's really not ideal. And I'm sure that, you know, the argument will be, well, we've had staffing problems because of COVID and people working from home and yada, 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 yada. Well, indeed, you and the entirety of the global economy have got the same problem. It doesn't mean you can afford to sit on things ad infinitum, which is why here the regulator has decided to take the action that it is.
Thanks, Peter. I think it's as well quite poignant to say the fact that the fact here that in the enforcement notice they have asked that by the 31st of December of this year that they need to carry out such changes to their internal systems and procedures to make sure that this doesn't happen again, which is a little more than just saying you need to give these data subjects their requests. No, this is going as far as say you actually do need to pull your socks up and improve here because this isn't good enough.
Exactly. They don't want to turn around in December and find that the figure's gone from 7,000 to 27,000. So therefore it's got to, you know, show that this will not happen again. Show us what you're doing to deal with the backlog and make sure that others won't be left in the same position. So they've got a lot to do. It's not the work of a moment to establish a mechanism, a workflow to handle and turn around these subject access requests. And having done that in bulk myself, having set up a system that was able to deal with these using bulk review via electronic means, having actually gone in to help a government department that was in a similar situation trying to turn around subject access requests and was using a photocopier and large marker pens to try and redact and get information out the door. It kind of shows therefore the need sometimes to have good workflow, good systems and good software and the right resources in place to get these things turned around where you know there is going to be a volume of them. So certainly the MOJ is going to have to establish that system and get it working and demonstrate it's working before the end of the year.
We'll just have to wait and see and hope that they do turn this around. So our next story is in regards to the Dear Mum scams. So there's a growing number of people that are losing thousands of pounds to scams asking them to send the money to family and friends, which is supposedly in need. So these fraudsters are contacted, again, mainly on WhatsApp. See the big red flag here, folks. And they pretend that they've lost or damaged their phone and having to message from a new number. But obviously they're using fake contact details to make kind of the fraud more convincing. So the scammers here are kind of preying on parents, kind of wanting to protect their children. And obviously it's a little bit more concerning, this one. I'll pass over to Peter to continue.
Thanks, Amelia. Yeah, so this is the growing prevalence of these sort of scammers that prey on the heartstrings. So the idea is that you might receive a new WhatsApp message from a previously unregistered number coming to you saying, "Hi, it's so-and-so. I've lost my phone, I've lost my keys," or, it could be, at short notice, I'm on holiday somewhere or another and I've lost my keys, I've lost my phone, I've lost all this stuff, I'm stuck. Please send me, so many $1,000 or euro or whatever so that I can get home. Here's the sort code and account number. And of course, very often a parent will want to help and think, "Oh my God, how's this happened?" and might transfer money without even thinking about it. And in that instance, of course, you do receive a message like that. Well, get in touch with the individual that you think has sent it via legitimate means. I hasten to add, don't get in touch via that WhatsApp message. Then, go back using your more traditional methods and find out if it's genuine. At one time, I was in a WhatsApp group where this same scam was pulled, and because it had been sent to a large number of people, the individual who was involved actually ended up messaging within minutes to say, "This isn't me," and there is no need to respond to this message. But after they'd done that, a few other people then went, "Oh, I didn't realize that. I've already turned around and sent the money. How do I get it back?" Well, the answer was you can't. And that's just it. It's just a matter of, as usual, sort of question these things before you end up acting, and don't follow the nefarious links or phone numbers that may have been used. And I appreciate it's all well and good to turn around and say that in the cold light of day, but it's another one if you think it is a close friend or family member that is in need. And that's why the scammers are deliberately doing this, to tug on the heartstrings and try and make people act before they stop to think, is this really genuine?
Precisely, and I think as well this comes at a time where there are so many scams going around. You and I, Peter, were speaking about a scam, the Royal Mail scam, the other day, that's still continuing on. This particular person had lost £9,000 to these scam artists, to the point where she then took out a loan in her own name for about £14,000 to give to these scam artists. And unfortunately, she didn't get the £9,000 back. Luckily, the loan was cancelled, but she lost £9,000. And for someone that's, I think she was around the age of 30, that is an awful lot of money to just lose.
It is. I mean, to be honest, we're sometimes talking about life-changing here in terms of the difficulty, the financial difficulties that people can be left in as a result of straightforward fraud.
So I think at the end of the day, people need to be really questioning when they receive these links and text messages, where they're coming from. And if in doubt, ring the person that it's coming from. Even if it's your bank saying, "Oh, this has happened," ring them back using an authentic number, because at the end of the day, they're not going to think, "Oh, why have they put the phone down on me?" when we're just ringing to check up on them. They'd rather you be hyper vigilant than fall victim to fraud, which in some cases they have to pick up the pieces and kind of give you that money back.
Yeah, exactly. And
so moving on to our next story. So this is coming from the National Centre of Cybersecurity, the NCSC, and this is from their weekly threat report. So the FBI have issued QR code scam warnings. So according to the public service announcement, cyber criminals have been tampering with QR codes to redirect users from legitimate websites to fraudulent ones, where their data and their money is all at risk of being stolen. So as businesses have been kind of increasingly turning towards QR codes, this is quite worrying. I mean, in the UK, in many venues, there are still QR codes up to scan when you enter a venue. So this is quite concerning. I'll pass over to Peter to unpack that.
Indeed. Thanks, Amelia, because this is an interesting one, because I think a lot of people thought the QR code was dead until the pandemic came along. I mean, it's technology that's almost 10 years old. It had never really taken off. Yet suddenly, when it came to the pandemic and the fact that a lot of governments around the world then established apps that you had to scan in order to then show that you'd been subbed to a certain place, so they could then use it as part of their track and trace systems. There's been a renaissance in the use of this technology, but very often a QR code is just something that, if it's within something like the NHS, for example, here in the UK, they've got a specific app that you're supposed to then scan specific NHS QR codes that have been provided to businesses that they can then post outside. So if you walk into a bar or a club, you scan the code, and then if it's found out there's been an outbreak there, they can notify you if it turns out you were there at the same time as someone else who had tested positive. So that was the principle behind it. However, when you scan a QR code on a normal QR code scanner, all it does is then take you to a URL and open a web page. So you can imagine that if you wanted to, now that we're getting more used to having to scan these QR codes, there is the potential that you could have a QR code that is nefarious and isn't actually taking you to providing necessary information for a track and trace, but is instead potentially taking you to a fraudulent website. It could take you to a web page that instantly then installs malware or ransomware on your device, or opens up the possibility of some other security compromise. And in this instance, it's being flagged up that yes, the FBI has issued this warning, and it's now being syndicated around the world to say, be careful of these malicious QR codes, which would then redirect from legitimate websites to fraudulent ones where their data and money is at risk of being stolen. It's just the sheer preponderance of these things mean that, if you've suddenly got millions of these QR codes being put out there, all it takes is for the fraudsters to put nefarious ones in, 0.1% of QR codes, but that still means there could be hundreds of thousands of fraudulent ones out there. So it's worth being careful. And if you do think you come across a fraudulent QR code, then report it to Action Fraud.
Precisely. And so speaking of fraud, according to reports, working from home rules have been blamed for the increase in fraud. So more than 8 in 10 mid-sized businesses in the UK experienced fraud in 2021, which is up 60% from the year before. So fraud costs the average company around 223,000 last year, and that's down from 245,000 in 2020. But businesses and professional services are blaming working from home. So moving to work from home in the pandemic has potentially caused this, because despite business owners and directors believing that companies are more exposed since 2020, the majority admitted that they had not done a lot to mitigate this. So I'll pass over to Peter to continue.
Thanks, Amelia. So this is when we've talked about this a lot now, and this is a podcast that started in the pandemic, and we're still in the pandemic. Surprise, surprise. But work from home really has greatly increased the risk. And I won't go into the nature of those risks. Suffice to say that an awful lot of organisations ended up switching to work from home at speed, when the priority was just get people working from home and worry about the compliance and cybersecurity issues at a later date. Well, now is the time, if you haven't already done so, to start worrying about those cybersecurity issues. So make sure that things like tablets, iPads, mobile phones, laptops, any other equipment that has been sent home with an employee, make sure that it is the right equipment to do the job. If you're going to persist with work from home, and an awful lot of organizations are, they're going to persist with hybrid working, not just for reasons of pandemic, but now also because some people would rather have a bit of time working from home and a bit of time in the office. Where that is going to happen, make sure you've got the right hardware that's receiving regular updates and has got multi-factor ID in place on it. And the same for the different systems that you might use, be it cloud storage, email, whatever systems you've got. Make sure that those are also sufficiently safe and secure at a bare minimum. I would also encourage any organisation where you're going to have an employee working from home more than one day a week for the foreseeable future, actually do an assessment. Have a member from your IT or security or compliance team go along to an employee's house and do a quick sweep. Where are they going to be working? Are they being overlooked? Are they using a safe network? Is that network encrypted? Is it partitioned from other personal devices in the home? There's lots of little measures like that that can be done just to make sure that your risk and the risk from the employee working at home is minimized to the absolute minimum. As I say, there is a lot of simple measures that can be taken. And now it's time to think about it. We're 2 years into the pandemic. Hopefully that initial panic and business critical necessity to just get people working from home come what may has passed. And now it's a matter of doing safe and responsible working from home in a sustainable manner long term into the future. And if you're going to do that, you need to be having these sorts of basic security checks and measures in place. That's the sort of thing that any regulator, not just the ICO, but if you're in banking and it's the FCO, the FCA or the any other professional or industry regulator out there, they would want to see that you are now taking concrete measures and you can demonstrate, if the worst happens, that you have thought about the risk and you've done something about it. So you can never totally reduce the risk, but you can go a long way towards reducing that risk, and that's what we're looking at here. Cheap, straightforward, ineffective measures to reduce the risk overall for your organization.
Thanks, Peter. And so our final story today is, I think this catchy headline kind of explains the entire story to me, really. Olympians warned to bring burner phones to Beijing. I mean, that headline says it all. So athletes are heading to Beijing Olympics with mixed guidance from their home countries about whether their personal information will be safe online and whether their devices will be secure. So experts are sounding the alarm about cybersecurity fears because of the Chinese Communist Party's known penchant for cyber espionage and desire to control online content. And so it's very interesting kind of different countries' takes on this. So Great Britain, we've kind of been given the advice that you can choose if you want to take your personal devices or not. And if you so wish, you'll be provided with new devices to take with you if you don't want to take your own. Other places like Canada, they're being briefed on cybersecurity and the risks of being hacked. Then there's the Australia, which is taking kind of a similar effect. I'll pass it to Peter to kind of continue going through these.
Yes, thanks, Amelia. I mean, there's some interesting outliers here. I mean, yes, different countries are being given different precautions. Some are actually being given burner phones and different equipment by their Olympic associations. Some of them have provided training. But the point is you've got to be aware from a security perspective, and also you've also got to remember that China has its own internet compared to everyone else. They call it the Great Firewall of China. And you'll find that an awful lot of the platforms we are used to using in the West, be it Facebook, Google, Netflix, an awful lot of these platforms are either available in China in a very different format with restricted content or not available at all. And you might, for example, if you're a journalist and you're wanting to update a blog or file content, you actually find that actually getting content out of China is a darn sight easier said than done. And therefore, it's a matter of these organizations with, if you're potentially taking dozens or hundreds of athletes to China, you're going to want to make sure that they have the necessary tools they need to stay in contact with loved ones, to update them on the process, on their progress, with minimum risk to their own equipment and their own profiles and systems that they usually rely on. So they're absolutely right to be looking at the security issues to try and minimize the risk of their athletes being hacked. But this is actually only one aspect in terms of the sort of support that they will have to provide. Because, as I say, the internet is very highly regulated in China, and will be a very different experience for their athletes compared to what they will be used to, particularly if they're traveling there from the West.
Thanks, Peter. I think the important thing to mention here is that there is another side to the story, of course. So according to China's relevant laws and regulations, citizens' personal and data privacy is legally protected, and it's the same going to be said for the athletes that are coming to the Beijing Winter Olympics. And while this has to be taken with a pinch of salt, we cannot go without mentioning that there is two sides to this story.
Indeed, that is quite right. And to be honest, I'm sure that China's looking and thinking, great, here are all, people coming from all over the world, and what sort of things are they potentially bringing into the country? COVID, for example, will be one thing. When we think that, I mean, for the last 2 years, Xi Jinping hasn't left China. And indeed, the majority of Chinese people have been prevented from going to China. And I know that there's an awful lot of Chinese people around the world, the Chinese diaspora, who've not been able to go home and not been able to go and see families, relatives, friends for 2 years now. Yet the athletes are being allowed in for the games, so that can take place. And I think that's probably quite difficult, I think, for a lot of people to be able to reconcile, thinking, well, I've not been able to see, family, I've not been able to see parents or siblings and children yet. This is all taking place. So there is a lot to consider, and as we started off talking about geopolitical issues, and indeed the fact that the games are taking place in China is a massive geopolitical issue and a big story of 2022. It's another major global event that is certainly going to be taking place, though again, perhaps not to the extent of the Japanese games, which of course the entirety of which was played behind closed doors. I think there probably will be local Chinese people spectating, but you won't have the thousands of international fans that you would ordinarily have attending a global Olympiad to spectate and enjoy the occasion. So the world is gradually coming back to normal, but we're still a long way from normality when it comes to these big spectacles like this. It will be interesting to compare this Olympic Games in China, and indeed from the perspective that it's in China and the current geopolitical issues, as well as restrictions around COVID. How will this have changed compared to that other big global event coming this year, the World Cup in Qatar? Another state that has quite a few restrictions on certain things, though it is indeed trying to roll out the red carpet when it comes to welcoming the world to watch the football later this year. But in the face of certainly in the face of some concerns around human rights, in the same way that China has had those allegations leveled at it. But the point is that when we're then looking, this is in January now, when it comes to December, will we end up looking at a World Cup that looks more like a traditional World Cup with thousands of fans going and watching and enjoying the games? Or will there still be restrictions in place that mean that still can't quite happen? This is the big, I think, question mark for 2022. How much of the world properly starts to emerge from COVID? How much do we return to a world that's closer to normal? How much do we have all of the usual travel and communications and interactions online and in the real world that we were used to before all of this happened?
It'll be interesting to see what happens, like you say, Peter, and see how our lives have changed compared to the last World Cup and the last Olympics.
Indeed.
So that was our last story for today. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar, and we'll be back next week. So just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, podcast channels as well, such as Spotify and Apple Music. Thank you for listening, and we'll hopefully see you next week.